The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I have the amendments before me on Bill C-79. Clearly, the Green Party will stand up against provisions that protect the rights of huge companies.
Proud to say we're the only party in this House that has consistently and always opposed investor-state dispute resolutions in every trade deal that comes through here. I want to thank the honourable member for Essex for her work on this as well. It's very clear that the New Democratic Party does oppose investor-state agreements in the context of the CPTPP, and in that we were only joined by the Bloc Québécois today in objecting to shortening the debate, even though the NDP, as the third party in this place, was prepared to bend and allow a shortened debate. Their amendment, which was rejected in this place, would have allowed debate that went for 5 hours as opposed to being shortened to almost no hours. It was amazing to me that that compromise position from the NDP wasn't accepted, and that the large parties in this place, the Liberals and the Conservatives, were all too quick to rush this bill to conclusion. Now, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which we're entering into in this rushed fashion, has been refashioned as the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, but it's very clear it's not progressive, and it may be not even comprehensive. I do want to focus, though, initially, as others have in this place, on the contrast between what we celebrate, and I do want to be clear, I celebrate it, achievements that were just achieved in replacing NAFTA with what has now been rebranded Trump-style USMCA. But while parts of the USMCA remain troubling, and I should mention what they are, erosions of supply management to protect not only our dairy farmers and other protected agricultural sectors, but present a threat to human health in Canada if bovine growth hormone contaminated dairy products are allowed to enter our marketplace. We remain concerned about the USMCA, about giving longer patent protections to pharmaceutical companies, thus driving up drug costs. We remain concerned about other sectors that are impacted by the new USMCA. But we are relieved that the auto sector will survive this. We are relieved that many other sectors have not been negatively impacted as much as Trump had threatened. The big good news out of the USMCA agreement is what the Prime Minister mentioned earlier today, which happens, ironically, to be the subject matter of the amendments that I argue in this place today. So what the Prime Minister celebrated today, and I couldn't be more overjoyed, honestly, overjoyed is the word to use, to see the end of Chapter 11 of NAFTA. Chapter 11 of NAFTA was the world's first investor-state dispute mechanism. It was the debut of a concept that is so inherently anti-democratic that it is astonishing how it has managed to creep in to nearly every trade agreement Canada has signed since. And now, essentially, the grandfather of all investor-state dispute resolutions is gone, but the illegitimate progeny continue to contaminate democracies around the world. I'll never forget how Steve Schreibman, noted trade lawyer in Canada, described ISDS when he was fighting for intervener status on behalf of Sierra Club of Canada to one of the many Chapter 11 cases that we ultimately lost, the one brought by S.D. Myers of Ohio, in which they claimed, believe it or not, that they were an investor in Canada, although they'd never actually built anything here, and they claimed their rights had been infringed because Canada banned the export of PCB contaminated wastes. We lost that case. You wouldn't believe it, Mr. Speaker. At the time at which an investor-state dispute resolution panel ruled that Canada had violated Chapter 11 by banning the export of PCB contaminated waste to the U.S., it was illegal under U.S. law to allow its importation. In this area of trade law, your only precedent to help you figure it out is to reread Lewis Carroll and Alice in Wonderland, because none of it ever made any sense. But as I was about to quote Stephen Schreibman in that case, he said, Chapter 11, investor-state dispute mechanisms are, in his words, quote, fundamentally corrosive to democracy, close quote. And yet, here we are in this place celebrating today, and I do celebrate, and I want to thank on the record our Minister of Global Affairs for her extraordinary work in bringing through a concluded agreement dealing with an administration as incoherent and unpredictable as the one that currently occupies the White House. I think regardless of political stripe, Canadians should celebrate that. We have much more in common as Canadians than in the difference, and I think those trying to score political points against this government for managing to navigate anything in the topsy-turvy world that one encounters when dealing with the President of the United States. We celebrate this big achievement that Chapter 11 of NAFTA is gone. Then why are we inserting Chapter 9 of the CPTPP that does the same thing, but with different countries? So with the advent of CPTPP, if we pass Bill C-79 as it is, without accepting my amendment, we will now be subject to the same corporate rule where foreign corporations have superior rights to domestic corporations from Australia, Brunei, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico. We already had Mexico ISDS under NAFTA, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, and Vietnam. Now, there's another truth that must be told about these agreements, because really Canada isn't at risk from TPP investor dispute mechanisms from Chile or Mexico or Vietnam. And I say that because there's a pattern. And here's the pattern, Mr. Speaker. We know from hundreds of cases that were reviewed by two major European Union think tanks, the Corporate Europe and Transnational Institute. They looked at hundreds of these cases that allow foreign corporations to sue domestic governments. Was there a pattern? Do governments tend to win? Do corporations tend to win? That's not the pattern one finds, Mr. Speaker, but there is a pattern. The larger economic power always wins. So when Philip Morris, a U.S. corporation, decides to sue Uruguay because they dared to put health warnings on cigarette labels, Uruguay is going to lose, and it did. When the U.S. decides, a U.S. corporation like Ethel Corporation, I mentioned S.D. Myers, Abitibi-Bowaters, or Bilcon, the very worst case, the U.S. corporation will win and Canada will lose. Canadian corporations, on the other hand, trying to sue in the U.S. nearly always lose because we're the smaller economic power. That's why it's extraordinary that it was the U.S. that wanted to remove this agreement and Canada that used it. I hope we were using it the whole time, holding it back, knowing it was a bargaining chip we were prepared to play. But we should never have fought to hang on to Chapter 11 of NAFTA. It's so deeply offensive. So here's the evidence. What this profiting from injustice is the name of the study. And their subtext is, quote, how law firms, arbitrators, and financiers are rushing investment arbitrations and gaining enormously financially. So it's basically, the words were used earlier in this place in a different context, ambulance chasing. Basically, law firms, arbitrators, financiers, and lawyers, individual lawyers, have made out like bandits on Chapter 11 cases and other ISDA cases. They represent, the arbitrators are for hire judges. There is no court. They are individual lawyers who both are arbitrators, who in the same firms often represent countries, or rather represent corporations suing countries. There is no justification for leaving this in CPTPP. And we have another precedent besides removing it from NAFTA, and that is that in the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement with the EU, individual countries have opted out of ISDS while still joining in the overall trade deal. Investor-state dispute resolutions are anti-democratic. They have nothing to do with trade. They have everything to do with transferring democratic rights to corporations. And we should pass my amendment, please, and take ISDS out of the CPTPP.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, I can appreciate the leader of the Green Party has been consistent, along with the New Democrats, on trade and trade agreements. Both parties just don't feel that trade agreements are a thing in which we should be moving forward on. I want to give a specific example as to why an agreement of this nature is of great benefit. It's all about enabling communities and businesses to be able to gain access to markets. And the leader might recall a company called High Life, which is in rural Manitoba. It's a pork processing plant. They export, I believe it's 95% of their product out of the province of Manitoba and into Japan, I believe it is. And without having those exports, that company wouldn't exist. Now, that company, Mr. Speaker, provides literally hundreds of jobs in a small community of Nipawa, a small but beautiful, dynamic community of Nipawa. It provides opportunities for many farmers and others. Canada is a trading nation. One of the ways in which we can have those good quality middle-class jobs is by allowing more trade to occur. Now, countries around the world will recognize that if you want to advance the middle class or advance the trade, that what you need to do is to secure those markets. And that's what this bill will do, Mr. Speaker. And I would ask the Leader of the Green Party maybe just to reconsider and recognize there are significant benefits too.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Well, the honourable member for Winnipeg North will know that in my speech I focused on the investor-state dispute mechanisms, which have nothing to do with expanding markets, access to markets, or trade. But since he raises the example of hog barns in Manitoba, I want to remind him that farmers in Manitoba did not want massive hog farms. In town after town, they tried to protest it. The former government of Gary Doer suspended the right of municipalities to say no to mega hog barns. The result is the contamination of Lake Winnipeg, significant toxic eutrophication because liquid hog waste has contaminated Lake Winnipeg. These issues are complex, and the small family farms created more jobs and more healthy ecosystems for Manitobans than massive hog barns, which leave the pollution behind for people of Manitoba while shipping the product out.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Longueuil.
The honourable member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for her speech because we can see her focus on a very precise amendment. But in front of the Liberal bulldozer, it's really hard to deal with all this. I'd like to know how she reacted to this because I'm not a specialist in international trade, but I did learn that in the United States, the two major parties in Congress and the Senate are always kept up to date on these various changes, but here we have to trust these people across the way. I'd like to hear what she has to say about this.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague. It's true that this is there's a story about Robert Reich, who was in Mr. Clinton's cabinet. He shared the story with someone else, and no one read NAFTA until the vote in the United States. I think the member that in the United States, congressmen don't always have the time to read. It's the same thing in the U.S. Congress or Canadian Parliament. And here we don't have the time to debate, but it's really rare to find one person who has done a true study, him or herself, on this issue and its various questions. I've been working hard for years against whatever favored international business and hurt our democracy. Order.